Welcome to the latest in our series of anti-tank chats. This time we'll be looking at one of the most easily recognisable, you might even say iconic weapons of the 20th and 21st century. It's the Soviet-designed RPG-7.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
This weapon has been used in just about every conflict worldwide over the last 60 plus years. It has evolved. It's not just the anti-tank weapon it was designed as anymore. It's become a form of highly effective, cheap, readily available portable artillery. And it's used by state and non-state actors the whole world over. Up to 2004, over 9 million of these launchers had been produced. And if you couple this with its ubiquitous stablemate, the AK-47, I mean, those are two weapons that have had a massive influence on world conflict ever since the 1960s. It's become quite common for the crews of modern main battle tanks to deride the effect of RPG fire. It's just black splatter on the armour. But in fact, when you look at it, even tanks like the Abrams aren't immune to RPG fire in the hands of skilled and determined opponents. Interviewed after the battle to seize the Al-Kabir Mosque in Fallujah, Iraq, on the 10th of November 2004, Major Griffin, US Army, had this to say about the effect of RPG fire on his Abrams tanks, supporting the 1st US Marine Corps.
You could hear it and see RPGs streak from a high level on one building, shooting down at a sharp angle into the urban canyon that Kilo was in. Some tanks were disabled, not a lot of extensive damage, but multiple. I mean, 12 to 15 RPG hits on a tank. The turret locked in position, the sighting capabilities were lost, and they had to start shuttling tanks back to get fixed.
For more lightly armoured vehicles, such as the US M113 armoured personnel carrier, or for crews in hot climates like Vietnam, operating with the hatches open, an RPG attack could be extremely deadly. The weapon we now know as the RPG-7 went through a whole series of developmental stages, starting in as early as 1931, in fact, with the RS-65, which was an experimental shoulder-launched anti-tank weapon. This did not have a shape-charged warhead, so I'm afraid it wasn't a success. A wheeled launcher, the RPG-82, saw some limited use with the Red Army from 1944. But in fact, probably a bigger influence were the American M1 bazooka and the German Panzerfaust. Both of these were handheld anti-tank weapons firing a shape-charged projectile. But the Soviet designers didn't copy or reverse engineer either. They incorporated the better elements of the design, along with those of the unbuilt Panzerfaust 250. That included things like a pistol grip and an electrical firing system. The RPG-1, which was trialled from 1944, incorporates quite a lot of features that you see in the RPG-7. Things like a metre-long launcher tube, an angled pistol grip, and a wooden sheath for heat protection. But there are quite a few problems with range and stability and effectiveness, and that design is binned in favour of the RPG-2. The RPG-2, which was accepted into service from 1954 with Soviet and Chinese units, incorporates quite a lot of changes. There is a bigger propellant charge, which is screwed into the base of the projectile. Projectile itself is an 80mm diameter high explosive anti-tank round. And you've also got a better fin assembly, which gives it a flatter, more stable trajectory. Put these together and you have got a weapon that will penetrate 225mm of armour at up to 200 metres. Used by the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong in Vietnam, the RPG-2 proved itself an effective anti-tank and anti-personnel weapon. The age of the rocket-propelled grenade had arrived. Although the RPG-2 was a reasonably effective design, there was still room for improvement, and teams working at the State Specialized Design Bureau at Krasnoarmeysk outside Moscow continued to develop the concept. We don't know too much about some of the development stages, but a team under V.K. Firulin was working on a project called the RPS-250. This incorporated quite a few advances, a better propellant and more of it, a separate booster rocket that's screwed into the base of the projectile, and a larger expansion chamber. It also, for the first time, incorporated an optical sight, the RPG-7. That had originally been designed for the RPG-4. In 1961, this design was accepted into service as the RPG-7. The initials RPG in Russian, by the way, mean Rushnoi Prototankovoy Granatomot, and that actually means anti-tank grenade launcher, but rocket-propelled grenade seems to have stuck. Looking at the weapon itself, and this is a Bulgarian example from the Tank Museum collection, the impression you really get is one of rugged simplicity. The launcher tube itself is 40mm in diameter, 957mm long, and it's made of 3mm chrome-lined steel. Now that last bit, the chrome lining, is quite important when you bear in mind the fact that this weapon could be in the hands of guys who won't clean it very often. It will at least keep corrosion at bay. The weapon's loaded by pushing the projectile into the front of the projector, and it engages with a notch that is cut into the top of the weapon. The important thing here to remember, though, is because the warhead projects forward, it's not just limited to the 40mm of the bore. Being able to fire a grenade with a diameter greater than 40mm is very important. In fact, that's the whole secret of the success of the RPG. On the underside of the weapon, there are two hand grips, pistol grips, and the usual way of holding the thing for firing is to have the right hand on the forward pistol grip, and that also incorporates the cocking lever and a safety catch, and the left hand, pull it up on your shoulder, and the left hand either goes on the rear pistol grip or actually on the top of the weapon to keep it stable. So on top of the weapon we have the flip up iron sights. These are, at least theoretically, secondary to the thing that goes on this rail here, which is the PG-07 optical sight. But we do have examples from the Al Nasiriyah arsenal in Iraq. They were produced without this rail, so there's no way you can fit an optical sight to it. Apparently the iron sights were good enough. We've also got a pair of sling swivels for carriage, and towards the back here there is a wooden sheath. This is wood which has been moulded, it's impregnated with some stuff called phenolic acid. It gives it a slightly sort of plasticky feel. Finally, right at the back of the weapon, there is the blast deflector cone. This is important. Recoilless weapons like this put out a hefty amount of backwash, and you have to allow at least 2 meters out of the back of the weapon, otherwise it's going to bounce forward and flatten you. You particularly need to remember that when you're in a confined environment, something like fighting in built-up areas. If you fire one of these in the room of a house, out of the window, make sure there's at least 2 meters behind you. Now looking at the weapon, you can see that the bore of the tube increases from 40mm at the front to 65mm towards the rear. This is the expansion chamber, and what this does is it gives the propellant gases from the projectile itself room to develop, and it gives the projectile its velocity. Looking at the optical sighting system, this is the PG-07, and as I said before, it slides onto a rail on the left-hand side of the weapon. It comes in a canvas pouch with a series of filters for use in different light conditions, and it's also got an illumination kit with a battery for use in low light. It's a reflex sight, and it's got an illuminated graticule inside that allows the operator to estimate range up to 1,000 metres. The way this works is the operator lines up the base of the target, wheels or tracks or whatever, with the horizontal line and reads off the range where the top of the target crosses the gradations. The 2.7 figure is apparently a compromise between the average height of Warsaw Pact tanks, 2.3 metres, and NATO tanks, 3 metres. In the centre are horizontal range lines at 100-metre intervals and crosswind and lead estimations at 2 mil intervals, creating a grid. Moving on to the other major component of this weapon system, that's the projectile, of course. And as I said earlier, the fact that the bore is 40 mil, that doesn't preclude the use of a larger warhead. And one of the reasons for the major success of the RPG-7 is the range of ammunition available. High explosive anti-tank, tandem charge rounds for dealing with explosive reactive armour, thermobaric rounds, anti-personnel rounds. I mean, there's quite a range available. This is the PG-7M high explosive anti-tank round, and this is the round most commonly in use. And it's basically, there are two major components as issued. So to begin with, you have got this, which is the warhead and the sustainer motor, the rocket motor. And then, screwed into the end of that, there is a booster cartridge. This sends it out of the container and also contains a set of expanding fins. Starting at the front, right at the tip of the weapon, there is a piezoelectric trigger. This is covered with a plastic cap and a safety pin with a tag, and that needs obviously to be removed before firing. When the trigger contacts the target, it sends an electric charge down through the body of the projectile, and that detonates the RDX explosive charge on the base. There's also a delay action element to this. The warhead itself will detonate automatically at 920 metres. Looking at the actual warhead itself, there is a trumpet-shaped liner in this section inside an aerodynamic fairing. And behind that is a copper cone, and underneath that is the RDX explosive charge. When that detonates, it fires what's effectively an enormously powerful bolt of kinetic energy forward. That's what's called the Monroe effect, and it will penetrate up to 260 millimetres of rolled homogeneous armour. Behind the warhead is the rocket motor. This is what we call the sustainer motor. Now, when you prep this for firing, you have to take a plastic protective cap off and then screw this waterproof cardboard tube onto the end of the projectile. This tube contains a gunpowder charge, and what that is a booster. That sends the projectile out of the container, sends it about 11 metres at 117 metres a second. And the tube itself also contains the collapsible fins, and they deploy for stability. The main sustainer motor then kicks in, and it carries the projectile onto the target at 294 metres a second. Now, there's something a little bit odd here, something a little bit counterintuitive. This motor actually burns forward, and the vents are arranged in a circle here. What that does is to create torque, and that helps to counteract the spin induced by the fins, and it also helps prevent centrifugal blast dispersal when the projectile hits the target. The fins help stabilise the projectile in flight. They spin roughly 10 times a second, but they can create something that's called the weather vane effect. So the fins themselves will catch the breeze and actually push the tip of the projectile into the wind. That can interfere with the operator's windage calculations, so it's something that needs to be taken into account. As it was initially conceived, the RPG would provide Soviet motor rifle units with anti-tank defences out to 500 metres. distances over that being covered by the BMP's own armament of the Grom 73mm gun and Saga missile. But it's been the RPG's supply to and use by other players that's created the aura around this weapon. The RPG-7 saw limited battlefield use by Egyptian forces in the Six-Day War of 1967, but it was in Vietnam where US Army M113s and US Marine Corps AAA V7s proved vulnerable. Even tanks like the M551 Sheridan or the Australian Army's Centurions were susceptible to being penetrated, even through frontal armour. One Centurion, Alpha 2-1, was hit 4 times, severely injuring 3 crew members. The RPG is most effective used by determined operators at close range. In Grozny, Chechen fighters were able to exploit an urban environment to engage Soviet armour at ranges of around 50 metres. Repeated hits would defeat ERA, and the Soviets are estimated to have lost upwards of 100 tanks and AFVs, mostly to RPGs. The sheer availability of the RPG-7 has led to it being used by non-state operators in a host of conflicts all over the world. British security forces in Northern Ireland were alarmed to discover that the RPG round would pass right through a Saracen APC. The Provisional IRA also used the weapon against British Army Sangers in Lurgan, County Armagh, and in Catholic areas of West Belfast. Beechmount Avenue being referred to as RPG Alley by British troops. In Afghanistan, during the Soviet invasion of 1980 to 88, the Mujahideen were able to exploit the terrain to score close-range hits on Soviet armoured columns using the RPG. This led, amongst other things, to the replacement of BMP-1's 73mm Grom turret weapon with a 30mm cannon for more effective defence on BMP-2s and 3s. The versatility of the RPG is also shown by its use against helicopters. In Afghanistan, 7 out of 8 US helicopters that were shot down were brought down by RPG fire, as well as 4 Black Hawk helicopters in Mogadishu, and that's the famous Black Hawk Down incident. With the RPG available in such huge numbers, it's become necessary to up armour, or at least produce some sort of extra protection for armoured fighting vehicles. ERA, explosive reactive armour, is the obvious solution, but as we've seen, that is actually vulnerable to multiple RPG hits at close range. US tank crews in Vietnam fell back on various sort of locally sourced solutions, as they had in World War II, in fact, things like ammunition boxes full of sand, extra track links, chain link fencing in some instances. Then we come across what is now the commonest protection against RPG fire, which is the stuff they call either slat or bar armour. This was first used on US Navy riverine patrol craft in Vietnam, but since then it's been used on a huge variety of different AFVs, from the British Viking in Afghanistan, in fact to this, which is a Type 69 main battle tank used by the Iraqi army. The way this works is that by making the gaps between the bars smaller than the diameter of the warhead, typically 75mm, the slats will trap the incoming RPG round. And that will either pinch off the fuse trigger, meaning it doesn't detonate, or it'll detonate at a sub-optimal distance and cause less damage. Bar armour is effective, but there are 2 downsides to it. Firstly, it adds weight, and secondly, it adds bulk to the vehicle, and that reduces your manoeuvrability. So, in its 60+ years of existence, the RPG-7 has had an effect on warfare the world over in a way that V.K. Firulin and his team could never have anticipated back in 1961. Incidentally, the following year, they were awarded the Lenin Prize for Technological Innovation. And then 2 years after that, 1964, it went to Mikhail Kalashnikov for the design of the AK-47. Can an RPG-7 round penetrate the composite frontal armour of a modern main battle tank? No, it can't. But it was never intended to. Is it a form of portable, reliable, cheap artillery that's had a huge influence on conflicts the world over? It definitely is. And furthermore, that's not the end of the story, because development has continued. The latest generation, RPG-29, that weapon system was responsible for penetrating 3 modern MBTs, 1 British Challenger, 2 American Abrams in Iraq. So the story of the rocket-propelled grenade has still a long way to go. Really hope you've enjoyed this. Please subscribe, and if you can, support us on Patreon.